Will you be blessed? Will you be blessed? Something was right to break the curfew. Some exercise a common virtue. Some receive strangers with arms open. Some take advantage of the system. Some will attack the hand which feeds them, while some show great appreciation. Some adhere to a hurting nation, with sudden rent and food inflation, brings out the best in us, or brings out the worst. Adversity will bless or curse. Will you be blessed? Will you be blessed? Will you be blessed? Will you be blessed?
Ok, así que esa es la canción con la que queremos comenzar, que es parte del proyecto de Streva en Montserrat. Creo que nos ayuda a pensar esta idea, ¿no? de lo que vamos a hablar hoy día, de los testimonios y los archivos, de cómo las personas viven ciertas experiencias y que esas experiencias con el riesgo son experiencias personales, pero que también hay un elemento colectivo.
At the same time, there's this collective environment that they share, right? So we're going to see these personal experiences and also the collective experiences, but we are going to see how these testimonies help us understand the risks, hazards, and how people behave. But also, we can use them as resilience and capacities methods, of people. So that's what we're going to see today. I also wanted to reflect on what we read for the session and to think about that the value of the testimony for history, right? And to understand hazards, to understand how they took place in the past and how they can take place again in the future, and how understanding or listening to these stories can help us overcome difficult situations and learn to continue, right? After a disaster. That's something that we're going to see today as well. So that would be the series of workshops on public history.
So last session we discussed science communication, risk communication, and Karina, she talked about how to communicate, how emotion, colors. Pueden apagar sus micrófonos, por favor. How to communicate and how emotion and colors and also audiences, how we have to design communication for different audiences. Jenny, she talked about risk communication for action, and I think that's something that we have to take into consideration in our work, how we can work together with the community to engage and have them have everybody understand and build that knowledge together so we can take action afterwards. And Cassandra and Paul also mentioned how young people and how digital platforms can be a bridge to that communication and that action. So if anyone wants to say something about the text that or the videos you saw for this session, or if you want to add something about the work we did on the last session. Nobody, nadie quiere comentar algo más.
Nobody know? Nobody wants to say anything else?
Bueno, están todos a ver, María.
Yo, Elisa. Bueno, me pareció súper interesante.
Marisa is saying that she thinks it's very interesting to share those videos on the Armero did disaster. And I remember something about the video. You know, one of the people that talked about his testimony said that young people don't really remember the volcano and the eruption. They think that nothing could happen. And in the end, history repeats itself because in the past, the same thing happened. Like people didn't think that anything could happen, and then the disaster happened. So I think that it's a reality that we live in, you know, that can adapt to our context because the current generations in Ecuador, we haven't really lived any disasters. The last one we had was the earthquake, and that was the closest thing we've experienced, you know, that resembles a disaster. But we haven't really been hit by other types of events. So I think that it is important to work on testimonies along with people in our case studies and to bring them to a level where they can tell their story, but also where we create this risk culture, which is very important to have. That was what I wanted to say. Yes, thank you, Marisa. When we're talking about young generations, the fact that they can be the new bridges, the new links, but we also have to aim at them because they sometimes forget, perhaps because they haven't been told the story or just because it's not something that's on their mind. So it's good to remind them, you know? And it reminded us about that with the video we saw. Anyone else? Well, let's move on to Teresa's presentation. Thank you, Elisa. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Can you see the presentation as well? Yes? Okay. I'm going to try and be quick about it. I'm going to try and highlight what Elisa said, you know, about the importance of oral history for risk management work in general, and also to maintain knowledge, right? Because knowledge needs to keep moving, needs to keep circulating in a useful way for everyone. But it also has to generate and help us generate humanity and empathy. So, in that sense, I think that it's connected with what we saw last week about generating change, but through emotions. I think there's a connection there with what we saw last week. So I want to focus on oral history as as telling a story. I mean, as recognizing or acknowledging collective and individual knowledge that's there. No, it's out there. We all have it. I think that the exercise that Malena did a couple of weeks ago told us a lot about that. How we take those stories to our families. I mean, how that knowledge is a part of us in a way and helps us take decisions as well. Tell to keep this sense of humanity. This anthropologist under here, Michael Jackson, is not the singer. It's an anthropologist that talks about the importance of telling, or what he calls storytelling, as an act of humanity. Human beings relate with one another through storytelling. If you can imagine how someone is told what they did today, that's kind of a story, you know. You're telling a story. So if we start thinking like that, we realize that that's how we relate each other, you know, through storytelling. And through that telling, we can also reinvent ourselves, and we can come to know new things about us, you know, and we can say, hey, we do reinvent ourselves, we change stories, you know, for good or for bad, and through that process, we get to know ourselves better. And I want to emphasize this telling, you know, as an act, as an action, not necessarily as the history that we are telling, but the process of telling and the importance of being able to tell that story. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the projects where we have emphasized oral history and the telling itself as important ways to generate risk management culture and to create change and etc. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First one are the Steva videos that some of you already saw. One Marisa talks about. These videos they went through a very long process, and we could talk about that in another time. But what's important is that we wanted to keep this and maintain the stories of those people. Now, young people like that Freddy says, like Marisa mentions, Freddy saying that young people don't really care, anymore. But also that's because maybe they don't know, because they're not told enough. So this video helps us to be able to share those stories, and it's not just to have videos, but also to have spaces that all three videos were taken to a public space, in 5 different locations around Nevado del Reyes, and presented, right? This is in Lerida, one of the settlements where people were offered to have houses, right? In between 1985 and, well, between 1986 and 1985 and almost 1990, that's when those houses were built. So here we had young people, older people, and it generated a very interesting response. But before moving on to telling you what the people felt or what they told us when we showed those videos, I want to ask you. Marisa already told us kind of what she experienced, but more in a sense what you felt. If anyone wants to say something, I mean, from those of you that had the opportunity to see the videos, I don't know if you could, but anyone? I can say something. Moved by the testimony of that lady that said that she lost her mother and her sister, if I'm not wrong, and that she was only left with her father, and that she lived with him for 11 years until he passed away. So that moved me. Her phrase moved me because it shows how these type of situations can change people's lives entirely, and that in a way shapes their future. So I would use the word like shock. Yeah, that would be the word that I'd use. Thank you, Elisa. Anyone else? Yeah, I also felt admiration. I had a feeling of I was impressed, yes, but I also felt admiration for these people and how they rebuilt their lives afterwards, after this disaster, and how they moved on. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to share a bit about how the people in those public spaces told us. Obviously, the first one says, in order to be prepared and prevent the same thing from happening again, we can't forget. That's similar to what Freddy says. And the second one is what you are talking about, Elisa. Says people were able to recover, but it was difficult and hard for people to move on, especially for young people, because this is a series of 3 videos, and we were very careful about doing them because the first one is very emotional, but the second one talks about the recovery stories, that are just as important as the previous one. That's part of the story. The story didn't end when the disaster occurred and 23 people died, but the story continued, especially for those people that were still alive. And everyone remembers the people who died, but what about us, the living? We that had to face reality, that didn't have our families anymore. I mean, those recovery stories are just as important, particularly talking about risk management, but also at an individual level. So that's what we did with the videos, try to highlight what you're talking about, the admiration for these people. I still admire them. Some of them are still my friends. I want to tell you that Sarina, the person you were talking about, Elisa, they have, this strength, this something that it's a part of the stories that we can't stop telling and stop talking about, because there's something to recover from that process. I also want to talk about this project called Identificarte, where we worked with people that lived from forced movements and they were settled in high risk areas. We used spaces to dialogue and tell, right? And to tell the stories of how they were affected in the first place by violence and how that leads them to settle in high risk areas. It had 2 objectives. First, understand risk trajectories, and second, understand the capacities that generate or that are required to face those risks, violence and this displacement, and actually living in a high risk area. We opened these dialogue spaces, or we designed these spaces. One of them we called conversations through music, and we wanted to for them to share a song with us, and tell a story of their lives through that song. Why that song is important to them. There's a video that I can share with you afterwards, where we explain all the steps we took for that project. Right. Another of the methodologies we used is one that we made up at that time, and it was called historia andando, which is kind of history walking in one word. So that's we would just put these two words together, history and walking. And here we have our friend Consuelo. And what we did was that once we talked with her and we had her story, we drew. We asked an artist to draw the most important moments of that story, and we went back to Consuelo, and same with some other 40 people, right? And they could tell us, what were the most important moments or the most important capacities that they had to show in these different moments of their lives, right? Of their story, while they were walking. And Consuelo, we asked her to keep these capacities in this little box that she's having, she has in her hand, because those are hers. She's completely empowered about that process that she had to live through. That's what Elisa was talking about. It's that admiration. It's not only the admiration that we have, but they also need to feel admiration for themselves, because they faced great amounts of difficulties. Also, we have this topic about collective memory. In this project, Identificarte, through theater, we told collective stories, and also through dancing, we created stories. Through conversations, through dialogues, we created very nice scripts where people told their stories, and not only for themselves, but they told them for a larger audience. In both cases, it happened in the public square in front of a lot of people. There was just people that was walking by, but some and others that were invited. And what does this telling do? I'll do the reflection afterwards, but the thing is that there's individual stories and collective stories, collective memories that are important to remember. From Nevado del Ruiz, this one that I'm telling to you about people displaced by violence in Colombia, and etc. There's many examples. Also, through oral history, we can have an exchange of experiences, an exchange of knowledge. And with Proyecto Esteva, but also through a fund that I managed to get my hands on, we were able to facilitate these exchanges. Here it says exchange Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador. Elisa Sarina is here. I don't know if you can see here. Sarina and Donelio, they both appear on the video. And I can't see him right now, but Jorge is there as well. He's from Ecuador. We invited the three of them so that they can go to Guatemala and tell their stories about how it was for them to live through the disaster of Nevado del Ruiz, but also the Tungurahua, and those people that were affected by the volcano fire. I can't tell you. It's hard to tell these stories, or it's very emotional moments. But Sarina, telling them their stories to the people of Guatemala, and also Jorge and Donelio, these are moments that are very powerful. I mean, through that story and through that oral knowledge, that can actually generate change. And they also generate empathy. They generate this idea that they're not alone, that they were not the only ones affected by this type of disaster. And we also had an exchange where we invited a couple of guards from Tungurahua volcano, and they told their stories to the people living in Colca Valley that are affected by Sabancaya volcano. And it was also an amazing experience. I mean, we as researchers and the people from there as well, we all learned a lot from the experiences uh, that these guards from Tungurahua volcano had. But apart from guards, they're agricultures as well. So they're farmers. I mean, they can tell them how ash affects
corn affects habas. These are crops, that they also have. So these exchanges are moments where these stories and experiences become spaces for transformation, or ways or moments where something positive can happen. I mean, it's about sharing, right? It's very different. Like when I tell a story about Tungurahua, very different than when Jorge, that's the guy that went from to Guatemala, or Victor, that's one of the guards that went to Peru. Uh, it's different when they tell those stories. People listen to them differently because they actually lived through those stories. So that's also important to remember. And kind of to summarize, this idea of telling as a political act. We can generate transformations through individual and collective stories. At the individual level, this is, for instance, something that one of the participants from Proyecto Identificarte told us. That was the theater play that I showed you. And she tells us it was a very beautiful, very special experience. It empowered me of things that I didn't know I had within me. It woke up this sense of wanting to share with my community everything that I have inside me and that I didn't know how to express. This is just one of the many testimonies that we have of what did it mean for them to be a part of that space, to have the opportunity to tell their story. And not only at the individual level we see this, healing moment in a way, which is also telling us it's also showing the importance of telling, to heal. But at the collective level, we also see that, and we've seen it in many experiences. But also for the decision makers, something that came from Proyecto Identificarte is that those stories, when telling them at the public spaces, was actually aimed at decision makers. And this is one of the quotes and testimonies. That's one of the most important ones in my entire career, that actually keeps inspiring me and makes me love what I do. Was the director of risk management of Risaralda, and she says, after seeing the dance of the indigenous women, she says, being here right now is very sensitive, especially because knowing that behind each of you there's a story, a sad story, a story of fighting, a story of overcome. I congratulate you, and I think that sometimes we have to say sorry, because we cannot forget that all of you have lived through difficult moments and that you fought to be here with us. I mean, that acknowledgement is very important, but also what other people have told us, that's people that we have worked with. Sometimes they see them like they don't know, that they don't understand, that they are ignorant, that they lack education. And the fact that they actually can see them, performing a play, performing a dance, just makes them think, hey, they're capable. They're not just asking for stuff. And that's how we change the narrative. Through what? Through telling the stories, It's storytelling. And I love that. I mean, I think that's very relevant for this meeting. What the director of risk management is saying, Carolina, that's her name. She says that's one story. I mean, behind each and every one of you, there's a different story. Sometimes they're very hard stories, Sometimes they're a story of overcoming difficulties, but creating those spaces to acknowledge these stories, I think it's very important. And as well, for us as researchers, these stories also changes because we also listen to them. We're also there, in this moment. And at the same time, when communities and decision makers, they're changing us with their stories, we can also recognize that scientists can tell stories. That's something that we're doing with Jenny. I mean, how scientists in the area of volcanology, at least, they can tell stories, to their students many times, and their stories about, what they have seen in volcanoes. And that's also a way of sharing knowledge, not only through academic papers, but also through their stories and through their experiences as volcanologists that actually go to the field and, and have to respond to these volcanic eruptions. So, kind of to wrap it up, I propose this idea of opening spaces to dialogue, through knowledge, through stories, through feelings, through empathy, and through humanity. I mean, that's where I think we can actually experience change. And in all the examples that I told you and in the videos that you saw, we don't have to be afraid of feeling, right? And sometimes in the academy, we have a fear to feeling, that for people to see us cry and whatnot. And you can't imagine the amount of times I've cried, with people, with communities, and that's made me grow as a person. And but that's also made me feel, that's made me feel, and to have other people's make me feel, as a person, that I'm also there and that also share these stories with them. So I just want to leave that idea there, and this photo of this wall painting that we did in Guatemala, and this lady right here, is just contemplating it because she's thinking, hey, I mean, I can paint. I may not know how to write and read, but I can paint. So I'm just gonna leave you with that. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. That was very nice, inspiring. Maria Antonieta, it's your turn. Let me just quit sharing my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Yes? Okay, cool. Hello with everyone once again. And today today I want to do something a bit different. I'm going to take you to the world of the archives and to the world of the past. But I want to do it in a way where all of you feel identified with that past. I've, I've called this conversation Disasters and Archive Research, Testimonies, Invisible Testimonies, or Invisible Tracks. To kind of leave, a track of what we have seen, both the invisible and the visible. And I would like to start with this quote. It was very inspiring for me when I started studying history, and it's actually still very inspiring for me. It says, what do we understand as a fact by documents, if not a mark? I mean, a stamp perceptible to senses that has left a phenomenal that in itself it's impossible to relearn. And us historians, talking about tracks and stamps, we dive into a world of documents and in a way of how we see things, and what we have to study are actually archives. In Quito, we have many, many, many archives that are very, rich for all the documentation they contain. Unfortunately, they're not. I mean, not all of them are in the best condition, and they have also experienced many losses. But I would like you to join me in meeting one of the archives that I had the opportunity to research, do my research for more than 30 years. It's the Archbishop Archive of Quito, and I'd like to show you how it looks on the inside. In the entrance, it's in the Archbishop Palace in the central square in the historical district of Quito, and this is the entrance. Here's the room. I mean, we have to first ask if the conditions exist to work in the archive. These conditions aren't really the best always, but that doesn't really matter because I mean you forget all these problems because it's wonderful working in this world of archives. And this is the interior. Well, I love these spaces. I mean, as you can see, they aren't as comfortable as one would like, but this archive in particular has around 60,000 documents. You could have a lot more, but a lot of documents are abroad in the United States and such. And I wanted to tell you about the sections that are very useful for this project, for this specific project. This is the section of the archive called ecclesiastic government, and it recollects the actions of all the archbishops that have lived and worked in Quito. This is the parish inventory, where we can also find a lot of information about the lives, within these ecclesiastic parishes, and we can find data about the damages experienced by a natural disaster. And there's a last section that we also can find in many of the archives, and that's one of the most important ones most of the times, because they talk about documents under study, documents that are not classified, and here's where you generally find the most exciting information. Like I say, each one of these boxes is an entire world to discover, and that's why that's why I call this invisible and visible documents. I mean, in a first sight, you can't know which documents are going to be useful, right? But afterwards, I mean, the work of researchers and historians is to find those documents and make them available for everyone. And maybe I'm, not talking entirely about the academic part, because I like to do it a bit different. I think that I've shared with many of you the fact that it has been very, very hard, yeah, to work only with documents related to different kinds of disasters. And it has been a very sad story, right? To see what happens after an eruption, after an earthquake, after a flood, etc. And I mean, I really questioned myself. I was like, God, this is actually affecting me. It's taking a toll on me. But I decided that I had to turn it around. I had to change all this negative perspective and make them something positive. And I definitely wanted to share that with you. And I wanted to invite you to feel as a part of this story and of this connection that I've made through history, and kind of with all of you, and with something that's actually very special. Here I begin with this image. It's a panoramic perspective of San Francisco Square, and you can see the bell tower of La Compañía Church. This photograph was taken after the earthquake of 1868, and as you can see, it's a bit reinforced, and you can see some cracks there. I mean, I'm gonna invite you to dive into those cracks. I mean, this is a zoom in of that picture, and I've decided to talk about this bell tower because I think that through it we can identify ourselves. We can find a little bit of each of us there. I'm going to start by explaining this. A bell tower is one of the architectural edifications that suffer the most from earthquakes, right? For their height, for their rigidness, and this tower bell of the Compañía Church in Quito was the tallest one. It lived through many earthquakes. It suffered a lot, but it survived all of them until the 1900s. In 1879, it fell for the first time. It was completely reconstructed, but in 1878, it was affected once again, and they needed to take it down. But before telling you what happened with that tower, I'd like to tell you that connects us to many stories, right? Specifically, I like to say that people from the audiovisual syndicate, I feel really close to them. Why? These towers are bell towers, right? And before we had any other type of communication means, they communicated events such as fires or earthquakes with these bell towers, right? So I was thinking about it. I mean, this is also a symbol of how we used to communicate and how now it's incredible the way in which we can communicate things. I mean, we have taken a huge leap, right? But it's still an architectural symbol. It's a communication symbol. And it's also a religious symbol, this tower. And as I've said many other times, to study natural phenomena, we also have to study the religious side that Quito has lived through. And as I said, you can see these cracks here and the condition that the tower is in. And what happened with this tower is that it housed the first astronomical observatory in Quito. And when we talk about that first observatory, we have to talk about the first polytechnical school. And here's where I wanted to tell you about our friends, the polytechnical school. Because why? I mean, this would be a view of what the polytechnical school was. It's also important to tell you that this tower of the Compañía Church is located in a very important building for Quito's history, and also very important for us because, I mean, if we as a group had gotten together many centuries ago and up to the 20th century, actually, I mean, we would have done it here, in this building right here, because this building, which was the central square for Jesuit, it didn't just house all universities. I mean, the Jesuit University, afterwards public universities, and afterwards the Central University of Ecuador. It also housed all the libraries, also all the archives, and so it was the place where science happened, where culture was created, and where we archived everything. I mean, this very important part of Quito's history. So, in a time, in the presidents of Gabriel Garcia Moreno in 1869, they decided to eliminate Central University here, and they created the first polytechnical school. This polytechnical school had its first academic course in 1870. So I think that it's been a very great opportunity for me. I mean, I had the opportunity to recreate the history of this building and to see one of the most important chapters of its life, how the first polytechnical school was created. And I find that 150 years after that, see what happens. We see, above the picture of the first professors, and down here, there's a picture of this amazing group that we are sharing amazing experiences with. And I mean, I'd like to thank Camilo a lot because he took the time yesterday to fulfill some of my crazy dreams, and he managed to compile, and to bring together this past and this present through their polytechnical school. And it's just I think it's a beautiful work of seeing, how professors were in the past and the members that make up our team now. I mean, and I'd like you to take a close look at these images, at the image at the right. And as we talked with Camila, I mean, we even look alike, eh? Here's the next one. We also have other professors of botanical school, the famous wolf that looks a lot like Camilo. And at the bottom, we see other former members, and on the right, the current members. And I mean, that's something that makes me very happy. That this world that used to be entirely male, male dominated, has transformed. And now we have a lot of women, present in this scientific and academic world. And well, now we say kind of goodbye to the Polytechnical School. And I'd like to move on to kind of make a link with our, let's say, British friends. And, within the documents that I found, I saw that there were 3 British representatives that were here, in Quito, and that were very much related to natural events in the 19th century. I thought that it was very nice, kind of to recollect the marks that these people made. In the first place, we have William Jameson, that, as you can see, was born in Scotland in 1796, and it appears that he died in Argentina in 1873, but he lived in Quito for more than 40 years. He was a professor of chemistry and botany in the University of Quito, and he was also an explorer and the director of the House of the Coin of Quito. And as you can imagine, the House of the Coin, and the University of Quito were located at the exact same building we were talking about before. Here, within the investigations that I managed to do, the National Archive, I found this document where, our, on top of all the work that Jameson did, he was asked in 1840, after some very serious earthquakes that Quito experienced, he was told to travel to the provinces of, to the area of La Tacunga and Riobamba, to see and to examine the hills, as they were called, and to see what was generating or causing these events. So Jameson, they ask him to go away, to travel. He accepts and says, the higher order of the government will be performed based on my limited geological knowledge. Here we can see his signature. That's something that I would also like to tell you. That's very exciting, to work with historical documents, when we can actually feel them, because the life of each person that was, that lived in those times is impregnated in that paper, and we can actually, feel how that energy subsists through time. Now we have to do it digitally, but in any way, in any case, if you ever have the possibility to visit an archive and actually feel the paper, it's an amazing experience. It wasn't part of the topic, but I wanted to say that in the lack of people prepared to actually research why natural disasters happened, they kind of just employed any scientist that could give them an explanation of what was happening. And in this case, they chose this character that was in Quito and who was very, very much linked to science and academy at the time. Now we have Thomas Reed. He came in 1862 and stayed until 1874, and he's a very important character, both for architecture and for this history of the seismic events, in Quito specifically. He was named architect of the nation, and as such, he had to kind of examine and see what happened to the city after the earthquake of 1859, particularly after the earthquake in Ibarra of 1868, that also had very large implications for Quito. But he was very much involved in all the reconstruction works. He was a planner, and he even wanted to make a new citadel in Alameda, which kind of didn't happen. It was just a project in the end. The idea of expanding Quito to the north already existed back then, particularly for this earthquake situation. And from him, I've recollected a lot of information. I haven't even taken any pictures from it, but I like to show you a quote that he had written in one of his reports about the earthquake in Quito of 1868. And to connect it to the emotions that we were talking about, this is kind of the emotion he felt when he wrote this report. And it says, "I've seen so much destruction everywhere that memory is not enough to say everything that has to be said about each of them. Such is the condition and situation of Quito today that it's almost impossible for the soul of the man to form an idea that could represent a larger disaster." And that's what he wrote in 1868. And now we move on to the last character, James Bartholomew. We know nothing about him, but I really liked the fact that I mean, that we found these marks of him, you know, in our investigation, that allow us to talk about something else. In the 1868 earthquake, I think it was the first event where we actually received international aid, and the British Empire was one of the, you know, countries that gave us the most. It gave us almost 80,000 pesos. It's not a manuscript, but one of the one of the most important documents. You know, the ministerial report sent to Congress in 1874. We kind of explained how we use those funds, those 8 funds, and we can see that there's, you know, a we can see here James Bartholomew. He lost his fortune in the Babura earthquake. So this is how I wanted to bring these stories together. You know, there are British characters that just is now. You know, now we have this series of amazing professionals that are working along with us in the project. I wanted to tell you that this these connections, you know, in the story of Quito, were already present, and you know they were surrounding science and the academy and all that. On the other hand, as we saw, I really like the idea of comparing the polytechnical school that used to be an entirely male-dominated world, and to see how more and more nowadays we see women, you know, more present in all the fields. And I mean, finding marks from women is much more complicated task, you know, particularly in the archives and in the scientific world. Anyway, you know, we can find and we have the possibility to find more and more testimonies and evidence. So I just wanted to show you 3 examples. The first of them is this traveler from Switzerland, Ida Pfeiffer, from Austria actually. She lived between 1797 and 1858, and on her second travel, she visited Ecuador. We can see that on her, she wrote her experience in her book, and in chapter 16, she talks about how she arrived to Quito, and in that she described the eruption of Cotopaxi. So I thought it was very interesting to see a testimony from a female traveler that was here and that had the opportunity because life happened. She happened to see, you know, an eruption of Cotopaxi. I copied here how she described that moment. From what I understand, she knew that Cotopaxi was erupting, but she did not have the I mean, she had not had the opportunity to see it. And the day that she was in Quito, she wrote what she had seen, you know, and she denominated it as a insuplia eruption. I think that's in French and it's translated an amazing eruption. And this is the second document. I mean, you're kind of more familiar with this one. This is the poetry that Josefa Betancuri Gonzalez wrote after the 1859 earthquake. It was actually very exciting to come across this poetry because it's not very common, you know, for it to be printed. It's not that it has, you know, an amazing poetical quality, but it's a testimony, you know, written as a poem of what a woman lived. And researching a bit more about it, you know, about who she was, that's what's amazing. Creating these links in history, she was a part of a family that housed Gabriel Garcia Moreno when he was studying in Quito. And looking at other documents, her house also was affected in a way by the earthquake of 1868, and Thomas Reed, um, was actually in charge of many restoration works in her area. So she was most likely involved in restoring her house. This is another image, that's located in the archive of the Ministry of Culture. That, just to tell you something, unfortunately, by an earthquake that took place in December 2019. It's been closed due to damages in the foundations of the building. It's been closed since December, and right now it's undergoing construction works. I just wanted to tell you that it's one of the spaces that has also suffered that has also been affected by earthquakes and also by politics. So anyway, this is an image taken in 1911 of the first woman that climbs Tungurahua. She's a German citizen. She was married to, I forgot the name, but his last name was Robalino. And she was the mother of Miss Isabel Robalino, that's almost 100 years old, and that she's still very active and is a part of the Anti-Corruption Commission. And with that, we finished telling you the marks of women that we found in the archive, but I also wanted to talk to you about marks that are more close to us, that are closer to us, and that they really shocked me because of how similar they were. I'm talking about this document that's located in the archive of the Jesuit. We can actually visit it digitally from the Spinoza Polit Library. Not now, before, when you could actually go to the building, but the image is not very well, but it's actually poetry that we're going to work with afterwards with all of you. It's called Free Song. They actually depict the horrible moments they lived on the earthquake. But what's most amazing about this finding is who wrote it. Fortunately, you can't really see it. On the top part, it's written Don Pedro Lucas de la Rea. Who is he? Well, he was born in Riobamba. He had two Jesuit brothers that were expelled in 1867. He kept in touch with his Jesuit brothers, and it's very much likely that's probably why his poetry is archived here in the Jesuit library. But what also made me happy is that this character is, how can I say, he's uncle and great grandfather of Elisa Sevilla Larrea, or Dear Elisa. That's how we make the connection, to her. And it was actually very exciting for me that centuries passed, and that Elisa actually has, one of her ancestors was a part of this history. And you'll see, how we're going to work with this document afterwards. And as a last reflection, that makes me happy, because I think we can all feel as part of the change that Quito is going to experience in the future. And I think it's been, something that we have done right as a project to include this historical aspect. And I just wanted to leave you with this thought that to think in the Quito of the future, we have to know its best. That's my intervention. If you have any questions or anything, I'm here and I'm open to reply. Thank you very much, Maria Antonieta. It was very, very nice. It was a very nice presentation. And I think that you are touching some of our emotions there. But I know the floor is open so that if any of you want to make a comment or ask a question, please do so.
¿Quién se anima a hablar? Anyone want to
Who wants to talk?
presentations? Daniel.
Creo que Cassandra estaba alzando la mano antes que yo. Pero después quiero preguntar algo.
Dale, Cassandra, perdón que no te vi.
No, yo quería decirles que
Just wanted to say that both presentations were very interesting because they're interdisciplinary, and they make us think about how to navigate this sea of information. I think that it's very stimulating and it's very urgent to get a hold of this, right? Because it's because everything is very emotional. So I think that all of these workshops have been very exciting for all of us, and I just want to say it was awesome. Thank you, Cassandra. I think that we're all living through the same. We get excited and work on at the same time. Well, my question is for both of you. You didn't have to really reply, but it's just kind of a question and a comment. You both mentioned emotions, right? And something that we as a human are exposed to all the time. That some of us, geologists, have a rock-like heart, but we do feel emotions. I can assure you that. But something that catches my eye, with COVID and everything, and with things that I see in TV as well, is that many of the messages that are transmitted to the people, and many of the ideas or actions that we want to produce on people, most of the times they come from emotions. And I see that the people that work in marketing use that a lot. And, and they use it more and more. And now a publicity from the phone company makes us cry, because it's so filled with emotion. But what I criticize most of the times is that, that approach, that emotion-driven approach, kind of neglects something that's very important, which is the objectivity and rationality. And I don't like to see that people are invited to do things and they get convinced only through emotions. I mean, I also swell up sometimes, but I think that it's also important it's also important for us to think that it's very important to create that rational thinking culture, an objective culture. That's why I wanted to ask, perhaps more Teresa, how do we avoid these situations when we invite people to show their emotions, just stay there, and then how do we make them from go to that to a more objective arena? Thank you, Daniel. I thought you were going to complain with Maria Antonieta because she used your picture. And Camilo, I'm going to, bite on Camilo because he couldn't find a better one, but yeah. And thank you for telling us that you have a hardened heart, I mean, I didn't know you can have that and cry as well. I mean, it's a very important point that you are making. When you say, when we say that emotions are important, we're not contradicting the other aspect. I don't think that we have to think on emotions as something subjective, logics as something objective. I mean, we see it through history or through science. You understand more and more that the whole idea of objectivity is something that we have constructed. You know, it's something that science has constructed. And that's something that Lisa can explain a bit more in depth to us. But I do agree with you in the sense that we only take advantage of emotions to generate or create an action from people that is not always the most appropriate one. What we have done in the project is that we always, follow up on the processes. That's why it's very important for us to have interdisciplinary teams. For example, on the exchanges that we have gone to Guatemala and Peru, it's not that we just go by ourselves and that people just talk. I mean, there are spaces for dialogue and there are spaces for criticism and reflection. It's not just that you're going to tell a story and that story is going to get accepted, right? I mean, Marjorie is here. She was there, and she's one of the scientists from Ecuador that also went to Peru. And that exchange happened between scientists and citizens, not only citizens, right? So I think that this follow-up that we do in these processes is very important. I mean, we don't just accept that. For the videos of the Streva project, that took us years. I mean, I performed the interviews for those projects after 2 years of working with those people. And it took us months to edit the videos. So you have to be really careful about every step, and you have to be very careful, about how you think on this. So I do agree with you. We don't just have to accept, and that's why it's very beautiful to share those spaces for us, for those of us who feel, and for those of you that don't. Marco?
Sí. Gracias.
Okay, thank you. Both presentations, I think that they show us, different ways of obtaining information. When we talk about oral stories and that, sense-driven methodologies, they kind of want to reconstruct information and obtain data, right? In the end. And when we talk about the archives, it's more obvious. I mean, it's a document source from which we reconstruct a story, right? So my question for both of you is, in what way does this information that's more cognitive in a way, particularly the first one, the oral story, when it's incorporated in an interdisciplinary exercise such as this one, in a scientific space, so to say, how does it dialogue? Something that Daniel said. How does it dialogue in the terms of its subjectivity with rationality that it's founded upon, right? I mean, on the science. I mean, that step from the data that's extracted from the sensor-driven source, from the documents, from history. How do you, or in what way does that dialogue with other type of information in an interdisciplinary exercise? I mean, that's my question. Maria Antonieta, do you want to go first? Yeah, of course. Okay. Marco, I would have liked to explain a bit more in depth what you're talking about, but I can do it now. I mean, the oral testimonies that Teresa was talking about, and what we find in the archives and the documents, those are also oral testimonies, right? But from a different time. But what we have to do is to prove those sources, because what we have to do is, see what one side says and what the other side says. We have been emphasizing on the fact that there's not one single story. So what we try to do with the archives is to find different testimonies that can help us reconstruct how this story happened, actually, And okay, so when you have an event of this magnitude, it's impossible to leave aside feelings, right? Because I've seen that every official report has a very objective part, right? I mean, Thomas Wynne, when he talks about damages, he says government palace has this and this and this damage, you know, this other building has this and this and this damage. He kind of makes a statement of what's the physical damage. But he also includes his emotional, perspective, which is also interesting. But I don't think that in any way the emotional part, and particularly in this type of documents, is more important than the objective part. And our challenge is to combine both of them. I mean, to find the largest amount of documents so we can compare and prove what they say. I mean, to say, yeah, this happened, no, this didn't really happen. So, I mean, was it created? Was it imagined? Your memory was kind of, forgotten through time. But I think that it's very important through different sources, compare and contrast this information and kind of, create a final product. Teresa? Yes, and to complement, okay, so you make a very important point, Maria Antonieta. Basically, what every social scientist does is this triangulation, right? Like you, Marco, when you perform or conduct interviews, as you interview one people, then you interview another person, and you kind of see that the story has similar points, right? There's always going to be differences, but that's the same thing as what we do. I mean, when we work with people, we interview one person, we interview another person, and in these collective spaces, particularly, people just start telling their stories, and they say, hey, but remember, that happened, and that's when this triangulation takes place. That's when, I mean, we normally do that by reading texts, right? But in these spaces, people do that. And I think that there's a more profound or more deep reflection that we have to do. That's why I would like Elisa to help us with that. That makes us think about how there are different hierarchies of knowledge and of ways of understanding the world. And that's precisely what we are exposed to. I mean, that's the fundamental question that Daniel asked. How is that what people are saying is more or less important than what the scientist is saying? And I think that's the biggest question. I'm not going to try and reply it right now and respond to it right now, but we should think about those hierarchies of knowledge. Where do they come from, and how power affects it? I mean, how we give more value to one knowledge and not to the other. I mean, the fact that it's written, right? That simple fact gives it value. I mean, like Maria Antonieta says, just the fact that something is written doesn't make it different from any of the interviews that I carry, right? I mean, they're testimonies. One of them is written, and that's why we're going to give it more value than the other. I mean, why does that have more value than the other? That's what we should concentrate on. That's what we should focus on. That's the scientific construct, that written knowledge is more valuable than oral knowledge, for instance. And that's why cultures and social groups that write are valued as, more knowledgeable. But there are other people that don't really know how to write or read, so they are, behind. I mean, that's the common perception. I mean, I'm not saying that's how we think. I'm just saying that we should think about it, and kind of to, respond to Marco. I think that it's important to be careful and that we can't, create emotions. I mean, and just that, because everything leads to an ethical question. Generating emotions can actually hurt. I didn't really talk about that today, but you have to be very careful about that. Like Maria Antonieta. So I mean, she told us it's been very hard for her to work on this, because why? Because you feel. So you have to be very careful about it, and not only from the objective side of things, from logics, from rational thinking, but also from caring about people, people that we work on and that we work with. Thank you, Teresa, Maria Antonieta. We are running out of time a bit, so I don't think, so if Giuseppe and Malena can write their questions in the chat, then we can continue. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we're going to organize the groups, and then we'll come back, you know, to our breakout groups. So please come back soon.
Gracias, María Antonieta y Tere.
Ustedes, gracias por estar ahí. Ve, y mucho más guapos los politécnicos de ahora que los de antes.
Igual de barbones ahora en esto.
Sí.
Teníamos que compartirles más fotos de las chicas que son más guapas, las politécnicas ahora. Pero
chévere la presentación, me gustó.
En el instituto las figuras femeninas son bien fuertes, o sea, nuestras dos últimas jefes han sido Alexandra Alvarado y ahora Silvana Hidalgo, ambas son buenas jefas, o sea, no como yo. y también está Patricia.
El Daniel les tiene miedo.
Sí, yo seguro. A Alex, a la Patti, a la Silvana, yo sí les tengo miedo, de una forma de miedo. Pero sí, la rectora también de la universidad ahora es una mujer. Alexandra Alvarado ahora también es la vicerrectora de la universidad, entonces ya había más fotos femeninas para poner ahí.
Daniel, tú tienes que decir que tienes corazón de geoda, que eso me gustó a mí el otro día.
¿De geoda?
Claro, no es de piedra. Daniel, por favor, no puede ser.
Sí, Daniel, además, qué feo que digas eso, porque
Sí.
no tienes corazón de piedra.
Yo, geólogo divorciado y hincha del Deportivo Quito, o sea, no me queda más que tener corazón de piedra.
Pero sabes, Daniel, yo creo que es importante porque a veces nosotros decimos que hay como una cierta objetividad, pero eso en la práctica política no funciona. O sea, por eso los políticos a ustedes nunca les hacen caso.
Claro.
Entonces no es que esa objetividad funciona ahora, y tampoco, ¿se acuerdan cuando yo les enseñé lo del terremoto, de ese temblor de 1919, donde los periodistas se burlaban de los sismólogos? Entonces también hay una relación con la ciencia que, o sea, si bien la ciencia pierde la objetividad, tal vez en la cultura política no les interesa. Entonces, o es visto como algo que no tiene importancia. Entonces también hay ciertas formas de como calificar esos lenguajes, esos conocimientos. Entonces, yo a veces no pienso en las cuestiones emocionales como emoción y objetividad, sino en una serie de tramas de decisiones donde se negocia eso. Entonces, eso era lo único que quería decir, pero como estamos en el break y estamos conversando, que me parece más interesante saber dónde se negocia eso, más que saber si es emotivo o no emotivo. ¿Me entiendes?
Sí.
Porque de hecho, mucha de la política contemporánea funciona y opera desde la emocionalidad de las personas. ¿Me entiendes? Y muchas veces eso es casi una cosa que es medio borroso, ¿sí? Es una cosa media extraña. Y entonces quizás lo que necesitamos es cómo estamos relacionándonos con esos escenarios, creo yo. Eso era lo que quería decir, ya que estamos aquí.
Gracias, Malena. Sí, creo que eso es una buena aclaración, en verdad.
Sí, porque no es que es lo emocional y lo racional, sino que esos dos se negocian.
You know, they're saying that it's not the emotion and the rational. I mean, they're both related, and you just have to find how they are related. That's fundamental. If you kind of see them as two sides, you lose the opportunity to researching the porosity in there. And you know, adding to what Malena was saying, the video and the paper talk about that. I mean, how through emotions we can create changes, you know, rational changes in the logic of our acts. So, I mean, you see something and you say, hey, volcano is still active. I mean, the volcano is still active and I have to take decisions on it, you know, that can affect me. Yes, you felt fear, sadness, whatever, and then you start making these connections. I mean, you can't really separate them, and they're together. What you have to find is what's the negotiation, the tension, and the interference between both of them. that's the road you have to walk. I mean, for instance, related to heritage, there's people that are very close to their heritage, and they're like, hey, we have to take care of monuments, churches, and whatnot. And objectively, they're saying you have to safeguard history, but there's a historical construction through that affection. So affections also generate transformation, and that's something that we have to be very, very, very clear about. I mean, you just have to find how you negotiate between those transformations. I wouldn't like to see them separated, and I think that seeing them separated is really useful for what we are trying to accomplish. Thank you, Malena. Cassandra? I was just thinking that, this kind of difference between the objective and the subjective is kind of fictitious in how it's represented, because, they can sell you whatever, like discussion we're having about poetry the other day. They can sell you something because it's represented in a way that for some people can be, written is it's fact, and for others is, how you read it, how it's written. So it's also the representation politics, not just, the data, whether it's oral, written, scientific, but how are we going to present it and what for? Because you can very much manipulate people, through that. I mean, the same way that you use an emotion in a detergent, propaganda, you can also use as a scientific fact to justify exploitation and all that. I mean, I think that politics that kind of work in both worlds can be, manipulated and used for evil. Yes, I was just making this question about how can emotions be useful, right? So, I mean, it's just that, Danielle, you have so much experience. You can't tell me that emotions weren't useful when you talked about cotopaxi in Los Chillos, for instance. I mean, that's the answer to your question. You're an expert, Danielle. You don't have a hardened heart. We're gonna write a song in your name. I mean, I'm just gonna, mute so you can let me talk. I mean, I was thinking, in situations where you have to respond, on the spot, and you have time to plan for things, perhaps an emotion is the way to go, to kind of make you act. And I was thinking about risk and how we can create actions that are needed, in that moment, or that are long term. When it's long term, you have time, to think and to put things objectively or rational, or I mean, really rationalize about the plan. But in the short term, perhaps that's when the heart, drives you, and then you do. I mean, I was just thinking that was my train of thought, and that was my question, But all you're talking about, it really helps me, yeah. So I think this is something we need to continue discussing about. To think that we need both sides, us as professors, we need to think about how you make your students learn is by, motivating them, making them feel that something's important, and that's a part of the emotions. I mean, I think that when we're working, we have to accomplish both sides. Talk with people to think, reflect, understand, plan, but also from a commitment that is created from these emotions. I mean, we need to think in a way of, bringing both of them together. I mean, we always want to separate them, but they're always together. And in order to move on to the exercise that Maria Antonieta has prepared, I'm going to let her explain, and I'm going to copy a link in the chat where you can find the texts for each group and the groups. Maria Antonieta, please. Everyone's back? Everyone should be back, otherwise we're not going to finish in time. I mean, I wanted to explain documents we are going to work with. Yes, is there time for that? I mean, it's
9:55 and we are supposed to finish 10:15. Okay, so please explain the exercise to us. Please, Elisa, you can explain them because you wrote the instructions. Okay, so here's the document that I just shared with you, where you can find, each group, the instructions, and you can see them in English underneath. So Maria Antonieta, copied this free poem that she talked about, and the idea is for you to do these two things. How do we know if something is true or not in a historical document? It's precisely by comparing it to other sources, to other testimonies, or to other documents. And that's kind of what we want you to do, how that exercise works. And as a second point, what can you, from the two texts, what experience can be useful for today, for discussion we had today, or to establish differences or similarities with the actions or reasons of recent facts. So it's already divided by groups. Depending on the group you land in, you can see the instructions for you, and we're gonna take it from there. So I'm going to.
Hello.
How are you, Jerry?
I'm very good. And how are you, Maria Antonietta?
I'm fine, thank you, too.
Very nice. Very nice talk.
Yeah, very nice talk.
Oh, thank you.
You have Los Gringos in your group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see that.
Hi with everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Marta.
Who else is there? Let me see. Adriana. Hello.
So usually what happens with this is that Cesar translates into the chat for us. So you can speak in English or Spanish and it will magically appear in the other language in our chat.
Great, great, great. So how can we get to the document?
Now, so I opened it before we went. So I hopefully copy link. Let's see if I can put it in the chat.
I sent you it right now.
Good. Adriana's already done it. And we are group 2. So what do we think?
Yes, I was going to ask you that. No, were you able to understand the both texts? Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So the first one is a slightly hysterical person.
That's it.
Singing a song about a big earthquake in 1797, and then the second one is written 2 years later, talking about the consequences of the earthquake. Yeah.
That's right. And it's not really a song, it's a poem, right?
Okay,
it's called a song, but it's a poem. But the thing is that I wanted you to be in this group because the other day we were talking about vulnerability, that often the poor, I don't like to say that the poor people are often the most vulnerable, but in this case, it happens that when there is an earthquake, I think everyone is vulnerable. You never know who is going to get the worst part. And there it says that our society during the colonial times and now also was very. We have all the difference between the very rich people and the very poor people. But the thing is that those very rich people had to find shelter in the poorest part of the city. That was those chozas. I don't know how to say that in English. Those huts. They were the only thing that kept. Voy a hablar en español, mejor no sé por qué estoy hablando en inglés. Sí, que justamente las chozas más pobres fueron las que resistieron mejor al temblor. Y la gente de posibilidades económicas tuvo que refugiarse en estas chozas. Entonces, un poco es esta contradicción. ¿Y qué es lo que pasa después con esta gente que está viviendo en ese sitio? Que obligan, o sea, un poco que obligan a que la gente, los indígenas que normalmente vivían ahí, tratan de desplazarlos hasta otro sitio. Entonces, ¿qué piensan ustedes de esto?
Yeah, but then what happened? Did the indigenous people, was there some bad management of their soils, or did the earthquake disturb the soils?
Let me, is Cesar still there? Let me ask for the translation because I didn't get well.
Yeah, he's going.
But I don't know. Oh, he's not here.
Ya no, pero luego ¿qué pasó? Hubo una mala gestión de sus tierras. ¿O qué pasó con sus tierras?
No, intentaron apropiarse de las tierras de los indígenas. O sea, de hecho, se apropiaron de la tierra de los indígenas.
No, the soil. Is it suelo?
Sí, el suelo, o sea,
el suelo.
Los terrenos creo que se refieren, al terreno en general. O sea, ¿qué pasó con el terreno? Que, o sea, ¿cómo les pudieron? O sea, que si no hubo algún control para que les desalojen, más o menos eso entiendo de la pregunta.
El gobierno no logró controlar este desalojo. No. Y después la ciudad entera se trasladó a otra parte. Pero durante el tiempo en que tuvieron que convivir los unos y los otros, trataron de que los indígenas abandonen esa parte.
Ah, okay. Yeah. It's the translation.
Bueno, yo creo que, bueno, voy a hablar en español.
Sí.
Pero yo creo que esto se ha visto desde siempre, ¿no? Este tipo de desigualdad, ya sea en cualquier situación y más aún en los desastres. Entonces, si por algún motivo, digamos, como en las personas menos favorecidas, los más pobres, pudieron como sobrevivir y sobre todo tener esta oportunidad de que sus chozas sean las que no fueron destruidas, o sea, su tipo de vivienda, de alguna forma siempre tratan las personas más afortunadas de aprovecharse de este tipo de cosas, y creo que fue el caso, ¿no? Y en vez de, creo yo, desde mi punto de vista, en vez de convivir o compartir este espacio para que los dos puedan estar a salvo, ellos intentaban desalojar a las personas que, viéndolo desde mi punto de vista, las estaban más bien acogiendo de alguna forma, porque era su vivienda, era sus terrenos, era su vida, su población, su barrio, lo que haya sido, ¿no? Entonces creo que este tipo de cosas nos enseñan como a ver que la conciencia es lo más importante y la empatía. Porque hay muchas personas que también tienen este tipo de empatía, este tipo de, o sea, de decir sí, o sea, vamos y nos ayudamos de alguna forma. Por ejemplo, tal vez las personas pobres tenían techo, pero no comida, y podían, digamos, ayudarse de alguna forma entre ambos para así sobresalir. Pero esto es algo muy difícil de conseguir en nuestra sociedad. Pero creo que a lo que debemos apuntar es a esa conciencia, o sea, a esa empatía que debemos tener todos, porque así va a haber desarrollo de las dos partes siempre, ¿no? Entonces creo que esto es algo bien importante, y creo que dentro del proyecto esto es lo que se busca, ¿no? Que haya empatía, que haya esta conciencia mutua para poder trabajar con todos, creo yo.
To what extent, Maria Antoinetta, the people who wrote things down, would any of them ever represent the very poorest at that time? They would just be empathizing, or would they be the very poorest? Could they write?
Yeah, they didn't nunca escribieron directamente, pero sí podemos encontrar sus testimonios en otro tipo de documentos, por ejemplo, en juicios, porque muchos de ellos se quejaron que les habían despojado de sus tierras o de sus pertenencias. Entonces, sí podemos encontrar. Hay gente que tiene que hacer unos informes oficiales, o generalmente algún tipo de autoridades. O en el caso de esta canción o de este poema que escribió alguien que quiso dejar sentado qué había pasado. Pero podemos encontrar también otro tipo de testimonios escritos que no quisieron hacer ese tipo de testimonios, pero que lo hicieron generalmente con un juicio, en los juicios que se dieron en esa época.
I wanted also to add something. We see that in one of the case studies in Laderas de San Francisco, their lands are informal, but very close to this part, they are legal urbanizations that the municipality agreed to formalize. So you have this, again, these two parts, the rich people who can own land legally, and the poor people who are in the same or near to the same area that are also in risk, and they are not able to live in a legal way.
So in the Caribbean, they used to have a space called the King's Three Chains, which was for defensive purposes. And after emancipation, after enslavement, the communities lived illegally on that land. And that's now why many of them are vulnerable to a lot of coastal hazards, because they lived very close to the edge. So that kind of creation of vulnerability through the actions following some other risk is very common.
Bueno, gracias a todos. Les tuve que sacar así nomás porque... ¿no?
A la mala.
Así que bueno, ¿quién quiere comentar qué tal les pareció el ejercicio que sacaron del ejercicio?
Yo puedo hacer un comentario muy rapidito.
A ver, Daniel.
Porque ya mismo me tengo que ir, perdón. O sea, yo leí los textos, había un fragmento de un poema y un fragmento de un informe de una persona del siglo XVIII sobre una erupción del Tungurahua, o no, un terremoto, ¿ya? Y cuando leí el poema, que no me di cuenta ni quién era el autor, ni cuándo lo escribió, solo me fui directamente al texto. Y al leer ese texto tuve la impresión de que estaba escuchándole hablar a una persona de Baños que fue evacuada en el año 99. Sí, entonces, y después leyendo el informe del corregidor, creo que es, también le vi sin ver quién era el que escribió ni cuándo, pero rápidamente me di cuenta de que era algo bastante antiguo, sí, con ideas un poco caducas. Entonces, lo que me quedó es que la cuestión de las emociones es como intemporal. O sea, puede corresponder tanto a una persona del siglo XVIII como a una persona del siglo XX. Mientras que la parte científica, eso sí cambia mucho y se puede identificar rápidamente a qué época pertenece. Eso me quedó a mí en la cabeza.
Gracias, Daniel. ¿Alguien más que quiera comentar qué impresión le dio este ejercicio?
Bueno, nosotros en el grupo discutimos un poco cómo las historias del tiempo anterior no son tan diferentes a las de ahora, entonces...
Things, from the past are very different than from things now. For instance, we're always worried about the amount of people that have died to measure how serious a disaster was. That's something that we still do. But we also identified this idea of justice. That's something that's not very discussed. I mean, who is responsible for the events? What acts or omissions led to the actual event? Another element we identified is how people, in a way, look to take advantage in any circumstance or use a given circumstance in their favor. It could have been, hundreds of years ago, or it can be now. Or my teammates were telling me that experiences they've had. And we also talked about rumors, rumors that surround disasters that we don't know if they're true, if they're not true, but that they want to tell us something in the end, I mean, that information that's moving means something. Thank you, Lisa. Someone else? Yes, group one, we reviewed both texts. The first one corresponded to a poem, and the second one to a report that was presented officially. And well, comparing the content in both of them, we figured that the truthfulness of the fact had different perspectives. So in the poem, for instance, we saw the use of hyperbole to try to impact and actually make people understand of how serious the event was. And the second one was trying to land more precisely on what actually happened. Everything was covered in mud and grass, and it's very easy to understand for everyone. So I think that was a very useful and concise way to convey information, even if it was just a poem that you were expecting it to be more emotional. And the report, on the other hand, gives us the truthfulness of what happened and complements it through specific ways. Like the thickness of the soil that was uplifted, how much was the area that was covered. So we thought they both complemented each other, and they were different perspectives to see or to look at information. But in the end, they both were trying to say, hey, this happened. Perhaps also to say that we thought it was interesting the strength that the poem had as a message. In very few lines, they told the entire story pretty much, while the technical report used a lot of paragraphs, and at some point it was kind of confusing, maybe even because of the language they used at the time. Thank you. Cassandra? we also thought about the reading prejudices. You know, when you see prose and verses, you are conditioned to think that one is more subjective than the other ones, while the one in prose was filled with subjectivity by assuming that the volcano is against us. You know, also making the mountain our enemies. So both texts were filled with emotions and subjectivity. So we thought about how complex it is, no, to understand the intentions of those who write. Thank you, Cassandra. Someone else? Hello, good morning with everyone. My name is Marjorie Encalada. Yes, my name is Marjorie Encalada. I'm also a geologist, graduated from the Polytechnical National School, and I'm working at the Geophysicist Institute, the Volcanology department. I think not all of you knew me, so I just wanted to present myself, and it's a pleasure. Well, thank you very much to invite me today. I think that this has been very interesting, very rich for me. And like Teresa said, I have had the opportunity to participate in some experiences with the community and with other scientists in Peru. I just wanted to talk about that very shortly and say that it is a very interdisciplinary arena. When we were there, we gave the talks, you know, very technical, kind of what happens, what we have studied in the institute, ashes and everything. But I mean, when the guards talked with the people, you could see a different light in their eyes. Like they were listening more intently to the people that also lived through these experiences. And it's not that, you know, it's just related to emotions or feelings, because the guards also have very deep technical knowledge. You know, I learned a lot when I was working in Tugurahua as well. So it's a very good compliment. It's a very good way to complement, you know, and a very good way to transmit emotions and knowledge. That's something that that's a very nice experience that, you know, remained in my head. And going back to this topic, we also read two texts. The first one was about the earthquake, you know, the poem about the phenomenon itself, and the second one was a report of what happened afterwards. So what we can prove is that there have been and there still are differences between people that have more resources and those who don't, because the text was talking about how the people that were less fortunate, you know, that had kind of hot huts to live in, these huts actually survived the earthquake, and then people that had more resources invaded their spaces and they just wanted to displace them from their houses and their territories. So I think that's something that we live nowadays as well, you know, this type of differences regarding the economic side, and it's related to awareness and a lack of empathy, because they could have, I mean, what they could have done is share the resources they had and live together and share, you know, and then it was a win-win situation. There would have been no problems and everyone would have developed. So that's kind of what we saw in. Thank you, Marjorie. I want to take the opportunity to introduce Marjorie. I didn't see you at the beginning of the session, but Marjorie is going to start on January or February. She's going to start her PhD with me, Jenny, and Jess. I don't think many of you know her yet, right? Um, she's also going to work with Elisa in the, you know, the citizen science, more in the education part, and it's going to complement with Isabel and with the case studies. So we just wanted to have Marjorie incorporate herself to the team, and well, welcome, Marjorie. It's great to see you again and great to have you share these spaces with us. Thank you very much. And I'm going to participate in everything that I can. I think everything. I think this is all very interesting, and I want to, you know, catch up to date pretty much. Thank you. Anyone else that wants to say anything before closing today's workshop? Well, I'm going to try and summarize what we did today. We've listened to presentations from Teresa and Maria Antonieta that were very rich to show the power, personal stories, testimonies, whether from people that are alive today, you know, through interviews or oral stories or through archives. And we were looking at the importance of testimonies, but also the importance of archives, you know, how we can find documents there as well, and how we try to prove this type of knowledge, you know, in those testimonies. And I think that in both cases, the questions and discussions are related to the role that emotions have. I mean, how these testimonies create emotions or emotional reactions in those of us who listen to them, and how we can learn from those past experiences, you know, that they're telling us. And we also talk about the objectivity and subjectivity and emotions. And I think that's a topic that we have to discuss more about. There's a lot to talk about in that subject, and we can discuss that side of things. Also, the authority side of things, you know, who's talking and who's saying things. I think that's something very important. And with what Danielle and other testimonies, if we don't see who's talking, we assume some things, but when we put a face and name to the things that are being said, we see it in a different light. It's the same thing now. I mean, when you see, you know, an institution or a certain scientific authority, you know, you see it with one light, but the witnesses also have an authority. And well, this is something that we can talk more in depth about. And I invite you to come to the next workshop that's going to happen after the sessions of August 10th. We talk about this, you know, innovation techniques. So we'll see you afterwards. And if you take a holiday, please enjoy. Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you very much, all of you. We're going to have a 3-week break. We're going to send you information about it, but we're going to continue with this series of workshops, you know, Friday workshops, starting on August 14th. So you're going to have a break, but please come back. Don't forget about this. Thank you very much. And goodbye, everyone.
Felicidades.
Chao.
Goodbye with everyone.
Chao, Camilo, y gracias a ti por toda tu ayuda.
No, de nada, Marianta. Un gusto.
Chao. Giuseppe, should we stay? Adriana, si puedes
Yeah,
quedar
just
un ratito.
really 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes.
Ok, gracias César por todo.
Gracias.